Okay, guys, today we have Clayton Welwood and Karin Litzcke. They both run for the last municipal campaign in October this year, and we did previous video right before the campaign. And now campaign is over, we have certain results, and we would like to discuss all results, all about that campaign, and then the opinions of the candidates, what could be done better or what shouldn't be done at all. So, and again, I would like to just let Clayton start and go from there.
Yeah, thanks, Eugene. Yeah, so we wanted to make this a bit of like a lessons learned and some reflections on how the campaign went. It was my first time running municipally. I ran for council in the district of North Vancouver, and it was your first time running municipally as well, right?
It was, yeah, and I ran for school trustee in Vancouver.
Yeah. So having run a couple of times provincially, and you've run provincially and federally, it was definitely a different scene at the municipal level, and I think I felt there was a lot of upside to it in terms of opportunities to connect with voters. The sort of I guess Vancouver and District of North Van would be different in this regard, in that we don't have any registered electoral organizations. In other words, political parties,
right.
In North Van, but they do in Vancouver. So I'd be interested first to hear from you, Karin, about that whole aspect of it, and if you found that it was easier to sort of I guess cut through partisan bias and just have voters hear your point of view sort of without some party color flag already coloring what they thought about it.
Interesting question. I would say that I had a fairly controversial topic as my headline issue.
Mm-hmm.
As you know, it was this issue of transgender ideology, although it was far from being my only platform. So, but it was easily the most controversial, and it was the one on which I was judged throughout. It was not, so I would say in a way it was a disadvantage, because in Vancouver, well, there is an independent disadvantage in Vancouver. I don't actually think there's a history of anybody getting elected independently. I should actually have looked into that before I decided to run independently, because I actually don't think an independent's ever been elected to the trusteeship, possibly not even to Parks Board or to council.
Really?
Like the last
Wow.
really strong independent run I remember for council was Sandy Garosino,
Okay.
who ran on an anti-casino platform. Oh, it must be 10, 15 years ago.
Okay.
And she actually ran a strong campaign, but was not elected.
Yeah.
I'm trying to think, maybe Larry Campbell as mayor was elected once as an independent, or was he elected as Cope? I can't quite remember.
Yeah.
But
wow.
Vancouver, because we end up with such a big pool of candidates and such a big slate.
Yeah. It was what, I think 137.
137 candidates
Yeah.
but it's a lot of positions. It's 27 positions.
Yeah.
But people, the results really showed how very strongly voters rely on party banners.
Yeah.
Because however much information you put out, however accessible you make it, and by the way, I don't think they did a good job of either of those things, people just cannot compute all of that.
Okay, that's interesting. When you say they, you're talking about the city of Vancouver and whether they helped to make people aware of the election, make people aware of their options, because that complaint came up in the district of North Van. I think at the time of one of our last all candidates meetings, most of the voters in the district had not got any sort of a flyer just saying that there's an election on, at least not from the district, right?
Right, yeah. No, Vancouver, so the municipal elections are all run by the municipality. So
Right.
it's an elections office that's set up. It's allegedly arm's length from the city itself, whatever the city is, but ours was the city acting city clerk was the chief electoral officer.
Okay.
So I don't know, she was at arm's length from herself, more or less. Not too persuasive. So and Vancouver puts out a voter's guide, and we may be unique in this, that we put out this book. It used to be a book that was sent to every household. It's now an online resource and just distributed as a book through libraries and stuff. Which has everybody's platform and bio in it. But even at that, like you say, 137.
It's a lot of research to do.
It's a lot of research to do. Yeah, and I got a lot of people who did tune into my campaign, liked it, and then said, "Who else should I vote for?" I mean, I kind of wrote up a little essay about voting strategy, or about my voting strategy, because I got so many questions like that. People they just can't. It's an overwhelming task, and especially because a lot of it actually aggravates the party. What to me is the party slate problem is that the parties. So we get 3 priorities, a little platform, and then our bio. And a lot of the party-based candidates, they just put the party's 3 priorities in the party's platform, and then they put their own bio. So you didn't really get anything. You're reading through them all, and they're all starting to sound kind of the same because you've read them, with the candidate beforehand. And there was a bit of drama surrounding that, which raises a really interesting point about, woke culture and election office objectivity and fairness. It's getting kind of interesting. And because in that book, I'm sorry, I don't mean to go on and on, but so you submit your material, and there's a qualifier when you send it in that says the city will not accept any material that is, hateful or whatever. So the city first they say, we won't edit, we won't correct. If you forget a comma or you make a mistake, forget it, we're not fixing it. And then they say, but we won't accept anything that we don't like, kind of thing.
But that could mean that they just reject your profile or your platform section in its entirety.
And that's exactly what they did. That's what we got a couple days after sending it in. My co-candidate Zelda and I both received a notice from the elections office that they weren't going to print our material. They were rejecting it. We had till tomorrow, like 20 hours later, to edit and resubmit. But she didn't tell us what was wrong with it. She just said, here.
It's like getting censored on social media, right? You violated our guidelines.
Exactly.
What guideline did I violate?
Exactly.
Don't know. Nobody there to respond. You're just
exactly.
blocked for however long you're blocked for.
So it took us sort of 2 days of emailing back and forth, and finally, although it was kind of interesting, Zelda decided to edit and resubmit. I said, you know what, I'm not editing. If you don't want to print it, just make sure that you put in that it was with, it was not published by that was your decision. But she then capitulated at the end of the week and decided to publish it all. So it was like absolutely nothing. We spent 2 days frantically emailing, because this is it is an important piece in Vancouver.
Of course.
It's probably the most important thing in the whole exercise, even if not everybody accesses that resource. It's there. It's what the media uses, So 2 days of battling for what's more or less an entitlement as a candidate to put your platform to the voters.
That's
So that
wild.
was quite something,
No, that doesn't bode very well for democracy.
Well, no, for the electoral process.
No.
And it was, in a way, it was foreshadowed, because the whole process was imbued with gender ideology. It was really interesting. So she'd rejected my platform in its entirety, and I had no transgender ideology. I said no climate despair, and I said COVID choices, not mandates. So I had 3 fairly controversial things as my top 3 priorities, and it could have been any of those. So when she answered, well, what is it? It was only the transgender ideology, and that was foreshadowed by the fact that in her introductory materials, as she sort of started supplying materials to candidates, she signs with her pronouns, which is like, I mean.
But wouldn't that be standard practice for a lot of people in like local government anyway?
It might be, but it doesn't come with, it shouldn't actually affect how they do their jobs.
Mm-hmm.
So it shouldn't affect their ability to deal with people who
Yeah.
don't give their pronouns or who object to the
course.
giving of pronouns. Like,
Yeah.
you should still be able to run on that.
Yeah.
So that's one of the reasons why wokeism is kind of an interesting libertarian issue, because because that's really like, it's not just the power of big government, it's the power of big government to impose a certain ideology.
Well, yeah, and to set the Overton window in that way, right?
Mhm.
To have this person who, it sounds like it was kind of up to her personal discretion, and whatever guidelines she had to follow were fuzzy enough that by the end of the week she relented and decided to publish it anyway. So
She must have had some other stuff going on that
Yeah.
influenced that. But then there was a demographic questionnaire in the nomination papers that was, it also had sort of the shades of gender ideology, but then it also asked a little bit about, it was just general demographics, like where were you born or something. And I think the question was worded, were you born on the lands now known as Canada?
Oh, interesting.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, which is like for an election on the lands now known as Canada, for the government now known as what is Canada.
Yeah.
It's getting kind of an interesting slant on
Yeah.
what constitutes, like what are, I almost have no words for it.
Yeah.
Like it's,
Well, the next few years will be interesting, right? Because wasn't one of the outgoing acts of this the previous City of Vancouver Council was some big piece on the land question, the question of unceded territory. And I didn't look in the details of that news report, but I think it was just this week, right, where they
it was
executed
approving
I don't know if a bylaw or a memorandum of understanding or what you would call it, but it was basically to designate certain lands where they're going to study the possibility of, you know, handing them over, or some sort of arrangement with the Musqueam or Squamish peoples, and so that'll be quite interesting to see. And there was a bunch of other stuff. It was about the application of UNDRIP to municipal governance, and
yeah. I saw something about that, not necessarily the specifics, but there's a huge parcel of land down at the west end of the Burrard Bridge,
right,
where that is Squamish territory apparently, and so they're building a huge development there.
Yeah.
And they're just, I think the plan is to just exceed municipal guidelines for density and height and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
It's just like, it doesn't apply to us, so we don't have, and you know, on the one hand I say, great, fine, that's great, but the difficulty is that to the extent that it ties into municipal infrastructure like sewer and so on, and then it's like schools, so it's like all of a sudden just the technological, logistical aspects of development do have to be integrated somehow with the city, and then they become, whose responsibility do they become to pay for?
Right.
Who has control?
And it's very fascinating. So I've been watching the Sanok development, and so that piece of land was actually, I just read this in an article today, I hadn't realized it, but it was added to Squamish Nation territory just in recent years, like 2003, within the last 2 decades. And so that's interesting in and of itself. And so it's a development corporation called MSD Development Corporation. So it's Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh, who have combined in partnership with West Bank Development to do these, 11 towers, 6,000 units, massive development. But the city recognizes that, hey, we can't impose municipal building code or other municipal regulations.
Right.
But they've taken a sort of a negotiation approach. Like, we realize that, okay, we have to connect to the city's, you know, sewers and water system and so on, and there's costs associated with that. And there's even costs associated with the city having to engage in all these negotiations for what is a totally unique new model of development. So it's interesting, the development partnership has agreed to actually pay the cost of the city's staff to some degree for all these extra negotiations that need to happen around it. So I'm really excited to see how this whole thing plays out, and if, it would be really interesting to see if being exempt from the sort of municipal zoning and Vancouver building code, which is much more stringent, particularly in areas of you know, energy use and, you know, phasing out fossil fuels and all those sorts of things, right? Accessibility, right? All these things impose extra costs, massive extra costs. I would just
That's a good point,
refreshing my memory on the a report that I saw a few years ago by the C.D. Howe Institute. So they released this in 2018, and they looked at municipalities across Canada and how much those land use regulations, specifically land use regulations, I think it doesn't even include the costs imposed by building code, but just, you know, mainly the zoning, right? And the cost of rezoning of property. So they figured that at that time it added $600,000 to the cost of a house, like a detached single family house in Metro Vancouver, $600,000. So effectively doubling the cost.
Wow.
And they looked at other markets,
Oh,
and
that's amazing.
it's massive. It's absolutely massive. So so this was one of the things I was talking about in my campaign, right? And I think it's people are aware of it, right? I think that
Maybe not the magnitude.
yeah, probably not the magnitude, but you know, I think there is a pretty good understanding among the public, certainly like among developers. They know how much it costs them to get something to market and go through all the hoops that they have to jump through, and, you know, pay not just the development permit fees, but also the community amenity contributions, right? So, and they're massive, right? Like they can end up being you know, like thousands of dollars, like per unit, right? So you imagine, like you're talking about really big money. So one of the things the sort of theme of my campaign was you know, bringing decision making closer to the level of the citizen, and how can we achieve that in the district of North Vancouver. And so one sort of simple, even though it's rather small, but I think it's achievable way that we could make that happen is, instead of, because the way it works now with these community amenity contributions is that the developer goes to the district and they say, okay, we want to build this and this and this, and so they go through the whole process of whether they're going to allow them to build and what they're going to allow them to build, and how much it's going to cost the developer and so on, and what the fees are going to be. But then it comes to decide what community amenity contributions are going to be. And so the spirit of it is, okay, we realize that having this new development here, putting a bunch of people where, you know, there were very few before, it's additional stress on infrastructure. And on the North Shore, our big problem is traffic, right? It's a nightmare. We've got all these, you know, choke points and you know, adding these high density developments. It really does make a difference in terms of traffic. So what are developers going to give back to the existing residents? How are they going to compensate them, so to speak, for the downsides of development? And so I believe that's how this whole community amenity contribution scheme evolved, is that the municipal politicians can then point to, yes, okay, we understand there's this downside, but look, you've got a new rec center. Well, probably not a whole rec center, right? But maybe a new wing,
a
or
new treadmill in the rec center.
Right. Or, you know, it tends to be, in practice, a lot of things like trails and parks and you know, cycling trails. Like in my neighborhood, where there's been a ton of development over the last decade, it's a lot of that sort of stuff. But it is actually the council and to some degree even like the municipal staff who decide what these contributions are. Now, there is a consultation process, right? You have these public hearings when there's a new development in town, and so people have the opportunity to voice their ideas of what they might want in the neighborhood. And, you know, good elected officials, they will, you know, keep their finger on the pulse of what the community is demanding. But that's not to say that that's a perfectly scientific process whereby people are actually getting what they want. I would say that, you know, the people who, like, if you can imagine, like, the eastern part of North Vancouver, right? So you've got this long Mount Seymour Parkway and Dollarton Highway that goes all the way out to Deep Cove. Okay, there could be people who live quite far from where all this development activity is happening near the foot of Second Narrows Bridge, but still, when they need to drive, you know, off the North Shore somewhere, they're still dealing with the same traffic, even though, you know, the new parks and cycling trails that were built in this new town center area, they're never going to use them because they live, like, you know, 5 kilometers away from there. So what, you know, if we were to ask them, they're people who are impacted by the development, what would they want? Well, who knows? Let's ask them. Let's find out. So one of my ideas is let's conduct a referendum and let people, you know, order rank their top amenities that they would like to see developers providing. And it could be something that is traditionally not part of the menu, so to speak, of amenity contributions. Something like, well, we want housing that's dedicated for our kids, right? I mean, it's kind of an out there idea, and I don't know how you would make that system workable to allocate, you know, newly built residential units to the whatever the next, and you know, maybe it's xenophobic or it's unfair or whatever, but it might be something that if we did that exercise of actually directly asking the residents what they want, we might find some interesting answers.
Well, the other side of the community amenities is that once they've decided what the community amenity in Vancouver, at least what the amenity is going to be, the developer usually gets an allotment to, you know, stick a couple more floors on top or something, so that they can pay for that amenity, so that it makes the units that much more expensive. And it's one of the long-term tragedies of development in Vancouver is that every time they undergo that exercise, they actually push the market, the whole housing market, into luxury. And so, because these units have to go for more to pay for the amenities, so the CACs, which are supposed to benefit the community, are actually putting housing out of reach. And I mean, there was an excellent article by Douglas Todd in the Sun just before the municipal election that just laid this out like clockwork. And the most concerned, the councillors who were the most concerned about homelessness were voting for these schemes because they didn't get it. They didn't get that you build more luxury units. Every time you do, you create more homelessness. So, you know,
well, particularly if you need to knock down existing affordable housing in order to do so, which with the crazy zoning schemes that we have in this part of the world, that's what often ends up happening. And you know, the last District of North Van election, that was the crisis issue that drove a lot of people to the polls, is that, they were, you know, tearing down and planning to tear down and, you know, or renovict or whatever, a whole bunch of people in these older developments. And it is a tragedy. And so I got to hear through this campaign some of the candidates reflecting on what was happening at that time, and even like sitting councillors who were spending their evenings like phoning around trying to find rental accommodation for something, right, for people who were evicted from a project that council had just approved, you know.
Wow. Yeah.
So it is quite tragic, and I think that I hope that realization is now you know, starting to dawn on policymakers and people who are running for office, that, you know, if you want to preserve affordable housing, you can do all these schemes that you want, right? You can get developers to say, we'll allocate this much, you know, of the building to subsidized housing and so on. But really the best way to keep overall levels of affordable housing in decent numbers is just not to tear down that existing stock that's still standing up.
Which means not to build as much as you want. And it's, you know, and I mean, it's one of those stupid things that if you fast forward through the next 30, 40 years, and you add, I don't know, 50 towers to Vancouver and 20 more to the North Shore, and 70 more to Burnaby or whatever,
Yeah.
which is the pace of building in Burnaby
Oh,
is
it's
insane.
It's phenomenal. Yeah.
You just build all that
Yeah.
stuff, and that's going to fill up.
Yeah.
And now what do you do? Like at
Yeah.
some point you have to come to terms with the fact that you can't keep expanding. You have to come to the terms with the fact that Vancouver can become full. Like unless you're going to start tearing down the 40-story towers and put up 80-story. I mean, it
Well,
gets full, and so you have to figure out a strategy for what do you do at that point.
Yeah.
Do you just let the slums? I made a little joke on Twitter the other day when somebody was doing a little pan photo of an area of San Francisco, which of course is a complete shit show, pardon me. And it's like, well, all the great cities actually have always had slums. I mean, that's been the distinction of the Western world, that we don't. We don't have the shanty towns. We don't have what are they called in different parts of the world? In Rio de Janeiro, what are they called?
Favelas and that sort of thing.
In Delhi in Manila. I mean, these big cities where they run out of room and people just start putting up shacks somewhere. Is that where we're going, or do we find ways to divert the traffic, places to send people? I don't know, but there has to be a better strategy than we have to keep building. And especially, as you say, to these codes.
Yeah.
So people have a choice between putting up a tent in a park and living in a building that is up to the very latest in soundproofing and eco-consciousness and electrical safety and disabled accessibility, as you say. Can we do something in between, where it's a building, it's standing, it protects them from the weather, maybe it's a little drafty, maybe, you gotta have a fire escape. It seems like it's housing utopianism, right? It's always utopianism at the base of it, it seems. We have to have homes for everybody. Well, not just homes for everybody, but really good homes for everybody.
Yeah. Well, you can't have your cake and eat it too, right? If you're trying to solve a housing affordability crisis and you realize that, that there's a supply problem. I mean, we could have a whole other discussion about the demand issue and what could be done there, but that's mostly a federal government thing, I would say. But if you want to address the supply issue, then how do you build something that I guess would meet some very basic standards of livability and size, but doesn't go overboard with all of this regulation, particularly in the building code and even within aspects of zoning, right, that are aesthetic things the amount of setback you have to have from, or something to harmonize the level of the roof lines, or all these sorts of things that basically come down to aesthetic matters that basically developers and builders they just simply don't have a choice. They would probably happily build something that a larger share of the customer market here could afford, especially in an environment of rising interest rates when it's becoming harder for people to get mortgages.
Right.
I'm sure they would happily build something that's less luxury if they thought that they could actually make a profit and recoup their costs.
Because they do, in the end, they do have to make that money.
Absolutely.
I mean, my metaphor is always, if it's got granite countertops, it's gone too far up market for what we actually need in Vancouver. Let's get some of those I can never remember, Formica countertops.
Yeah.
And if that's your standard of design throughout,
Yeah.
Maybe then we're building to who actually needs it.
Yeah. But I think before that realization comes that this can actually be done, I think you would need some sort of a case study, some sort of a local lab, if you will,
right, yeah.
where this type of housing can be built. And so that's actually what I've, coming out of this municipal campaign and what I've learned and what I want to work on next in terms of my political endeavors.
You're going to become a developer?
No, I'm not going to become a developer. But I think that there is an opportunity for developing some kind of affordable housing innovation zone in Metro Vancouver. And, you know, a lot of pieces would have to come together for
Right.
for that experiment to work. You would need to have basically some area of land that's not already developed, that you would have to get, you know, municipal governments, if they had jurisdiction there, to basically say, you know, like these special economic zones that, you know, East Asia and other parts of the world have
Right.
used to stimulate innovation and economic growth. You would need to do the same thing, where you need to exempt some regulations just within this small area, and nobody's going to be forced to live there if they don't think that the you know, the voluntary code that the developer has adopted is up to their standards. Nobody's going to be forced to live there. But let's just see. Let's let, you know, we have a strong building and developer industry. Let's just clear away the regulation in a small area. Let them have at it. You know, you'd need to set it up so there's some incentives for them to actually innovate, rather than just, you know, creating something that's you know, they're going to end up selling for high value anyway. You would need to set up the incentives properly, but I believe that there's a way that it could be done, and if it is done and they are actually able to demonstrate, yeah, we lowered our construction costs by using, you know, 3D printing of buildings, or
Right, yeah, or
right?
something,
There could be
yeah.
all sorts of different approaches that builders would use, and, you know, maybe there would need to be, you know, there needs to be some level of land use planning, right?
Yeah.
Like if it's a greenfield area, right, and there's no roads or drainage systems or anything, then there's all of that cost, and so there needs to be land use planning, and so that there's a cost associated with that. But could if it were done through a private developer, as opposed to municipalities, which are driven by political incentives rather than just the economic ones, could it be done for cheaper? I'm convinced it can be done
Yeah.
much cheaper, but I know that a lot of people won't believe me until they see it with their own eyes, so I think an
Yeah.
experiment is the way to go.
Yeah, I mean, and yet there's certain things that are somewhat obvious, which is that the regulatory environment is just, like it is the amount of government, the administrative burden that's placed on
Yeah.
the developers by a government that is, and it's partly, you know, a lot of city bureaucrats, and I don't use the word in a derogatory fashion. I mean, they're functionaries. They're doing jobs for us on our behalf, and they are the product of universities, and these university planning departments, especially, have become captive to certain belief systems and ideology, and it becomes a bit of a control thing, where, you know, you will go out and you will, I mean, you know, you keep coming back to education. A lot of these things start so much starts in education, and it's like it's then emanated out across the university, and then it finds a foothold in certain faculties where it becomes particularly toxic. So I've noticed for like 20 years, if not longer, that the university education faculties are attracting teacher candidates into their program by saying, change the world, become a teacher.
Right.
And you're like, okay, that's actually kind of weird, because that actually sends a really toxic message about what a teacher is.
Yeah.
It's not somebody who enables a child to go out and change the world.
Right.
It's somebody who uses the child to change the world the way the teacher wants the world changed. It's really kind of toxic.
Yeah.
Now you take that into the planning department, urban planning, land
Yeah.
design, whatever,
Yeah.
and it's exactly the same thing. The people who are going into those fields are the people who are like, the city should X. There should be more X.
Yeah.
You know, whatever it is, more cycling infrastructure, more highways, more whatever.
Yeah.
And it's not the people who want more highways, which is a good thing. I'm not saying there should be more highways. It's the people who have this, it's always this utopian vision. It's not, people should be happier in cities. People should have more opportunities to live in different ways, or
Yes.
the city should have more, you know, everybody should have more sunshine in their lives or something.
Yeah.
Or there should be equitable access to mountain views, which is one of my things in Vancouver. I mean, I feel like this whole idea of equality is driving this kind of community amenity scam, and things like mountain views are becoming privatized. It used to be that you could see the mountains from almost anywhere in Vancouver. Somehow, you could walk to the end of your street if you couldn't see them from your actual house. But almost anywhere, at least from 37th down to the water. And now, in order to see the mountains, it's like you have to get into one of these buildings and take an elevator up, and then certain people own that view of the mountains.
Yeah.
It's like they're privatizing views and sunshine, in the name of increasing equality.
Yeah.
It's become uninhabitable down on the street. So, it's so bizarre. It's this utopian view that's actually accomplishing the opposite of what it says it wants to achieve.
Right. Yeah, and so much of the climate policy stuff is this as well.
Mm-hmm.
So one of my frustrations with it when it comes up in well, particularly at the municipal level is whatever we do with, we could stop burning fossil fuels overnight in Metro Vancouver, and it's not going to make a lick of difference globally, right?
Yeah.
So therefore, when municipal policymakers are saying, we want to implement this, and that, and it's going to drive up the cost of your home. Well, of course they don't tell you that part.
Right. No.
Right.
Yeah.
To switch to whatever, all electric, or to get rid of pretty efficient natural gas burning furnaces, that sort of thing.
Starting on furnaces, yeah.
So so there's a cost to it, right? But they're saying, well, it's the same thing. They have been imbued with a school of thought. Well, we have this global responsibility. We're going to achieve this responsibility by forcing other people to do what we think is right, even if it imposes a cost on them. But the thing is, okay, to me, that's living out a moral vision of the world. It's not a pragmatic solution to a problem that you can actually affect with the policy levers that you have at your disposal.
Right.
So therefore, it is just ideology when it comes to this sort of thing. And maybe fair enough. The District of North Vancouver wants to have an all-electric vehicle fleet for their own. Okay, fair enough. But when you start imposing something like this on citizens when there is no upside to it, right? The only upside you get is you feel good because somebody forced you to do the right thing, but that's not morality. If you have to force somebody to do the right thing, it's no longer virtuous.
It's not the right thing.
Yeah.
No, it's messy stuff, and only time will tell whether the municipal elections put us on a better path or
Yeah. Well, okay, we've maybe got about 5 minutes left here, so I just wanted to touch on, in terms of like how the campaign was. If you think you'll run again, did it overall have an impact that you were satisfied with, given the amount of effort that you put in and that sort of thing?
Well, I'm not sure if I'll run again, but and as to whether I'm satisfied, in a way, time will tell, because I think we make some sort of an effort, or some sort of an impact on people. So I mean, you hand out X number of flyers, let's say, and a certain number of those flyers or certain number of those ads get clipped or stashed somewhere.
Yeah.
And then, or remembered even, and then 2 years later, I mean, 4-year terms now, right? This is a long period. It's not that long ago it was 3-year terms, and before that it was 2.
Oh, okay.
So 4 years is a long time, and sometime in the next 4 years, people are going to run into situations where they're going to remember you.
Mm-hmm.
They're going to, or they'll see your name in some other context, and they'll say, "Oh yeah." So something happens, like with my issues and people's kids in school, and then people right now, they didn't vote on this issue because they thought, this doesn't affect me, it's not affecting my kid. Well, sometime in the next 4 years, it's going to affect a lot of people's kids.
Mm-hmm.
And then maybe they're looking for sources of information, maybe they're looking for people to talk to about it. So it'll actually, we'll see what the impact is really. You can't measure it just on the basis of your votes. It really depends what happens in the next 4 years. And maybe instead of me running again, it'll be somebody who, over the next 4 years, becomes involved and engaged in those issues that I ran in and concerned about them. So.
Yeah, I took the same perspective to some degree. Like, so one of my parts of my platform was about road pricing, and I knew that this would be very controversial, or congestion pricing is maybe a better name for the idea, which would be, you know, to have tolls at certain areas that tend to be, you know, backed up during times of heavy traffic, and so maybe this would help to incentivize some other alternative forms of transportation, you know, people carpooling more, or maybe some private minibus service, or, you know, maybe more people cycling and taking transit. So, you know, I had some people who were just sort of like, oh yeah, that's a good idea. A lot of people, like, you can see as soon as you start talking about it, they're not going. I even got shouted down for it at one all candidates meeting, which was the only time I think anybody got shouted down during the whole, out of all the all candidates meeting I went to. They were very civil, but this obviously upset one resident quite a bit. But I had one of the sitting councillors sort of took me aside at the next day, and he says to me, it's actually a really good idea. It's just not politically feasible. And you're basically 20 years ahead of your time on this. But this is where things will go. And, you know, even the city of Vancouver, I understand, is doing some preliminary studies on it. But yeah, so that's my hope, is that, you know, I'm maybe just planting some seeds of, listen folks, we need to think realistically about how we manage peak demand on our roads. This is one idea. I think that the idea of just building more roads, it's not going to work in our particular area. And this whole, oh, well, we'll just build more cycling lanes and have more buses. Okay, it doesn't really work for who we are, people's lifestyle, and you know, the particular issues that we have on the North Shore. I mean, people like their cars there, you know? And I don't think that that's going to change. And so you can spend all you want on bike lanes, but I don't think it's going to really do much to mitigate our traffic problem.
Kind of hilly over there.
Yeah, it is. Yeah. So for myself, I mean, I think I might consider running again. I found it to be a really good experience in terms of just the ability to connect with voters. A lot more opportunities for that in this municipal campaign in terms of number of all candidates meetings. I think we had 5 throughout the campaign. So we've got a bunch of very active and well-established community associations in North Vancouver. And so they tend to sort of in groups organize these all candidate meetings, and they've done this forever. So that system is well established, and they were, for the most part, very well run, very well moderated. Yeah, very, very even-handed.
Were they reported on?
Yeah, they were, at least 2 of them were recorded in full and put on YouTube, and yeah, North Shore News picked up and reported on a couple of them. The library also had a very interesting event that they did for the first time, which was wonderful. It was much, even though I like the all candidates meetings and I think there's a place for them, sitting for 2.5 hours to listen to a whole bunch of questions and responses one by one can be tedious for a lot of people, even those participating. So what they did is they set up, they called it a speed candidating. So they had like all the candidates were sat around the perimeter of a room at the library. And then, you know, the general public was invited in. Anybody could sort of register for it. And yeah, so they just had people sit in, you know, ones or pairs with the candidates around the room, and then you had 2.5 minutes or whatever with each candidate, ask them whatever you want, and then you move to the next person, kind of doing the clockwise turn around the room. And it was great. It was really wonderful. It was really good for me as a candidate to sort of be forced to give my elevator pitch, but also to have the opportunity to see how that elevator pitch landed with people. And so one of the things I learned from that is if I say the words political decentralization, people don't necessarily know what that means, right? So that's kind of was the motivating concept of my campaign, but I realized that it will need to be formulated in a way that's a bit more accessible for people, and that some examples need to be given in order for people to understand what I mean by that. But yeah, that was nice to see some innovation in terms of the type opportunities that candidates have to engage with the public and for the public to ask questions of the
Right.
candidates.
Yeah, interesting, yeah.
Yeah.
So we would like to say thank you to our candidate today. Thank you for your input, for all which you can put in all the elections,
Mhm.
and I believe in a future one. So that was great information that you present. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks, Karin. Thanks, Eugene.
Thank you.